Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 1, Halacha 1 of the Art Scroll. It's 1A1. So, the rules of Kalayam, and again, as we were talking about in the general introduction, there are 5 different categories of Kalayam that the Torah talks about. The Chapter 1 is going to be starting to talk about Kalei Zerayim. And the laws of Kalayim are prohibiting diverse types of plants to grow in close proximity to each other. And this prohibition is only going to be where the plants are of different species, but what it's trying to show is it's not going to show varieties. So like if I have white wheat and I have red wheat, that's going to be a variety of one another. That's not going to be a problem. But we're going to need the oral law to come and teach us that that's not a different species. And based on this rule, the Mishnah is going to list 6 pairs of plants with each other, where the pair is not going to be Kilayim, and the other, it's going to belong to the same species. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that these pairs are not Kilayim with each other, but with any of these other 6 pairs, they would be Kilayim. For instance, we have in here the Cowpea. That's going to be like a type of Fava bean. And we're starting off with wheat. So certainly wheat and the Cowpea, this Fava bean, would be Kilayim with one another because they're very dissimilar. They're not like the same variety of species. They're different species. So each of these are going to be Kilayim with the different set that the Mishnah is going to be talking about. But with each of these varieties, it's going to be okay with each other. That's the organization. So it's talking about chitim, and it starts off talking about wheat and Darnel, which in my mind is really one of the most interesting and deep ideas in all of Kalayim. It's talking about this type of product that becomes corrupted. You thought that you were going and planting wheat, and basically what the sages are going to be saying is because of your sin, the ground became corrupted and something else came out of it. And in fact, it's not edible. It has virtually no use. And you thought you were working and you were plowing and you were de-weeding and you were fertilizing and you were watering it and tilling it, and you were also making sins, and something corrupt came out of it that has literally no use. This, says the Mishnah, the wheat and Darnel are not Kilayim with each other. That is a big hiddush because Darnel is non-edible. The wheat is edible. That's what we do. It's the foundation of human civilization is wheat. And it's not Kilayim with each other. So it's trying to show that this is coming from it. It's a variety of it. And again, this is here as something that is very, very agadic to teach us that human virtue matters in terms of getting parnasah. And the Torah says many times, if you listen and you obey, you will get what you need from Hashem. And if you don't, things are not going to work out the way that you expect. And God is continuously creating. And if you are not behaving, the laws of nature themselves will change and become corrupted in a way where you're going to get divine punishment based on your work product. And that is what this is showing. So wheat and this corrupted form of wheat, which is non-useful and which is non-edible, they are not Kilayim with one another. So if you had wheat and a patch of this corrupted Darnel, which is there, really like just thistles, it's not going to be Kilayim with one another. That's a big hiddush. Mishnah continues, it says, similarly, barley and oats are not Kilayim with one another. So that's one of the things here, like wheat and barley would be Kilayim with one another. They're different species. But barley and oats, says this Mishnah, is basically putting this as the same kind of same kind. And there's some maloket. Some people are putting this as rye. So some of these are going to be a little bit hard to understand. So you have to look at the Meforshim for help. Then you have the next set that's going to be spelt and rye. And Rashi is going to be identifying this kuzmin as spelt. And by the way, in the cosmopolitan Hebrew, kuzmin is going to be spelt as well. And so in the modern world, it's going to be identified as spelt. But again, we're trying to figure out what are these species. And then you have the next set, which is going to be the Fava bean and the Nile Cowpea. And that is going to be based on the Rambam interpretation of these two species. Then you have the Perkedan and the Tofach. And the identity of this exactly is unclear. Some are going to say that this is vetch. Vetch is going to be what is fed to animals. It's just animal feed. Then it continues and it says the white bean and the shius. And the Rambam is basically saying that it's a white bean and that it's another kind of like black-eye pea. That's the Rambam commentary. Then the last set is going to, well, it basically says they're not Kilayim with each other. So basically what it's saying that each pair is not Kilayim with each other. However, as it's saying that one pair with a different pair would be Kilayim with one another. So if you have wheat and you have this white bean, that for sure is going to be Kilayim with one another. So we have here in Vayikra 19:19, the verse is saying, "My statutes you will observe, your animal you shall not mate in a mixture of breeds, your field you will not sow with a mixture of seeds, and a garment of shatnet's mixture will not come upon you." So that verse lists three of the prohibitions that fall under the category of Kilayim. You have the mating of the diverse species of animals, you have the planting diverse crops that are very close to each other, and then you have the wearing of the garment made of these mixed fibers, specifically going to be wool and linen. So we have now this collection of trying to put together what is going to be a rational farm that the Torah allows versus a forbidden farm that the Torah does not allow. So the Gemara is trying to teach these two varieties of the same species are not forbidden with each other as Kilayim, and the Gemara is going to provide a biblical source for the law. And it was written in the Torah that your field you shall not sow with a mixture of seeds. And based on this alone, says this Gemara, I would have said that the prohibition applies to any two kinds of seeds, even two kinds of wheat, or even two kinds of barleys. In other words, based on this, how do you know that you're talking about a different species rather than a different variety? We have winter wheat and we have summer wheat. We have red wheat, we have brown wheat or red wheat, and white wheat. So how do you know it's not talking about mixing white wheat and red wheat or summer wheat and winter wheat? How do you know it's not talking about mixing barley, two different kinds of barley? How do you know that it's not talking about mixing two different kinds of very related types of beans together? So, like, for instance, the Fava bean and the Nile Cowpea apparently are very, very similar, very, very close. They're not Kilayim with each other. So basically, it's going to be a variety of one another. It's a variety of a Fava bean. How do you know that it's talking about this versus, say, like a completely different kind of bean, like a chickpea? That, by the way, would be Kilayim with one another. So how do you know this? How do you know that it's not going to limit it to variety? That's what it wants to know. The Gemara continues. It says that the verse also states, your animal you shall not mate in a mixture of breeds. And based on this alone, I would have said that the prohibition applies to any two kinds of animal, even a black ox and a white one, or a white ox and a black ox. In other words, Like, how do you know that if you mate a black ox to a white ox, it's going to be okay? Why don't you say that the Torah says a mixture of breeds and this variety and that variety are going to be like different ones? Or maybe you have a different species or variety of cow. There's apparently a lot of different varieties of cows that do different kinds of things. And they're all cows, but they look very different. And they're even used in agriculture in different ways. How do you know that you can't just mix and breed this one to that one? So the verse also states, a garment of shatnez mixture shall not come upon you. And based on this alone, I would have said that the prohibition applies even to two kinds of wool or even two kinds of linen. So, how do you know that it's going to be wool and linen? Maybe you would talk about camel hair. Maybe camel hair and linen should be forbidden. But we're talking here to dispel these kinds of notions. The Torah says, this Gemara specifies elsewhere regarding garments of Kilayim. It says, you shall not wear shatnez, and then it says wool and linen together. So that's how we know, for instance, that you can wear camel hair, like they have nice camel hair jackets, and linen, and how you can wear camel hair and linen together. We're talking about wool, like sheep's wool or goat's wool. So in this verse, which speaks about garments, the Torah names two distinct species. That's going to be wool and linen. And therefore, the verse quoted earlier, which mentions Kilayim of garments together with the other forms of Kilayim, like seeds and animal, are going to be interrupted as teaching. Says this Gemara that just as Kilayim of garments that Hashem prohibited to you involves two distinct species, where this one is not merely a variety of the other one, and the other one is not merely a variety of this one, so too the Kilayim that I prohibited to you in every place involves two distinct species, like wheat and barley, or cows and sheep, whereas this one is not merely a variety of the other one, and the Gemara says, and the other one is not merely a variety of this one. Rather, the prohibition of Kilayim is going to be exclusively to two different species. So this is basically saying that just as the wool and linen is showing in the Torah as two different species, and you have something that's coming from flax, the flax plant, and you have the wool which is coming from sheep, and these two things are not to be made into a garment together. We're talking about two distinct sources, and so we're talking over here as a Gezerah Shava, just as over here you have for wool and linen over here, it's saying that you would have over here for the mixture of seeds where you can't mix wheat and fava beans, for example. It has to be two distinct species, and if you have two distinct species, it has to be separated. But if you had winter wheat and you had summer wheat or red wheat and white wheat, that's going to be a variety of one another, and that's going to be okay. So, for instance, it would be like if you had wool from one kind of sheep, like a merino sheep, and then you had wool from another kind of sheep, even if it's going to be a different color wool, like sometimes they have black wool and sometimes they have white wool, and there are different varieties of sheep that produce different qualities and varieties of wool itself. That is going to be okay to mix with one another. The Torah talks about mixing wool and linen. And that basically says the Gemara is showing you that a variety is going to be okay, like mixing a black ox with a white ox, but a different species, that would be forbidden. So something in animal world which would be a mixture that would be forbidden is you have these hybrids that you can find on the internet. For instance, they have where they've mixed a lion and a tiger. I think they call it a liger, and they will create a sterile offspring. So you will have this weird mix, and it's sterile. The Mishnah stated that wheat and darnel are not Kilayim with each other, and by specifying that wheat and darnel are permitted together, the Mishnah implies and says, this Gemara says, but each is forbidden with barley or any of the other plants in the Mishnah. In other words, the Mishnah is trying to teach that each pair is going to only be permitted with the other member of the pair, but not with members of the other pair. So again, you can't mix the fava bean with the wheat. You can't mix the fava bean with the barley. Only with the pair. So, and I'm not talking about the pear of the fruit, right? We're talking about the pair of seeds for like Yerushalmi, or grain. So we're talking about either the beans or we're talking about the seeds that would come from grain. So the Gemara now is going to go to the next question, talking about wheat and Darnel, which it says wheat and Darnel are not Kilayim with each other. And the Gemara is assuming that Darnel is not a food. It wonders why the Mishnah mentions it. And the Gemara says, in the case of something that is not food, would we have made a mistake and taught that it is subject to the laws of Kalayam? And so then why did the Mishnah have to say that Darnel and wheat are going to be allowed together? So basically the Gemara, says Rabbi Kanievsky, is assuming that Darnel is unfit even for animal consumption, and certainly it's going to be unfit for human consumption. The question is, why is it that Darnel is going to be allowed together? I mean, the Gemara is really wondering, since Darnel is not food for an animal, and it might not even be food for a human, it's definitely not food for a human, and it might not be food for an animal, why would it be exempt from this Kalayam law? It should be like a different species, and it should be like trying to mix wheat with the fava bean. It should be something totally unrelated. And the Gemara is going to get and basically be saying that wheat and Darnel are actually not Kalayim with each other. And even though it's not going to be food, it might not even be food or useful for an animal. And the Gemara is wondering, why is this in here? Now, the Gemara answers, and Rabbi Ba Bar Zavda, it's going to be one of the Amorim, says that Darnel is subject to the laws of Kalayim because there are places where people maintain it in their fields to feed it to doves. In other words, there are some places where they'll actually feed it, feed it to animals like doves. And since Darnel would be used as animal feed, at least in a few places, although not generally, it would be subject to the Kalayim laws everywhere. So the Mishnah has to teach that Darnel may be planted with wheat. And the Gemara is going to wonder why this mixture of wheat and Darnel does not constitute Kalayim. And the Chazan Ish, in his commentary on Kalayim in his book 1-2, titled Kalayim, which by the way is excellent, is saying that it is clear from the Gemara's answer that even if a plant is eaten only by animals and not by people, it is still subject to the laws of Kalayim. In other words, it has to at least be edible, at least in some way. So the Gemara is going to object to this answer given by Rabbi Ba Bar Zavda and say that that's only going to be a minority view by the Tanaim. And the Gemara says, but that which Rabbi Bar Bar Zavda said accords only with the minority opinion of Rabbi Lazar. It does not accord with the Tanakama majority view of the sages. The Gemara says, for we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere, this is going to be in the Mishnah in Kilayim 5:8, where it's going to be saying that if one maintains thistles in a vineyard, Rabbi Lazar says he has rendered the vineyard and thistles forbidden for benefit. But the sages say he has not rendered it forbidden for benefit. In other words, you have special rules that come along with vineyards. And, vineyards planting wheat and vineyards next to each other can create a problem. Now, if Darnel is going to be a subset of wheat, then it would look like perhaps planting this next to that would create a problem. So the Gemara is going to object to Rabbi Ba Bar Zavda's answer, and it's going to start with trying to explain both sides of the dispute. It's going to start with Rabbi Lazar's explanation, and the Gemara says Rabbi Abahu says Rabbi Lazar's reason for deeming thistles capable of prohibiting a vineyard is that there are places in Arabia where thistles are maintained for the purposes of feeding them to camels. So in other words, he's saying that, look, even if the thistles are not Darnel, and it's just thistles, and the thistles are going to be used as food even just for an animal somewhere in the world, like Arabia, and just for camels, just for a specific food source, just for a specific animal in this out-of-the-way place in Arabia, well, that's going to be enough to forbid it everywhere in the world. Now, the Gemara is going to turn to the sages who disagree with Rabbi Lazar. The Gemara says, what do the sages hold? And basically, says the Gemara, is can they hold that there are no places in Arabia where thistles are maintained for camels? And that's not what the argument is. In other words, that's not what they're claiming. Okay, so what's their point? So the Gemara says that, they would, if it looked like they were saying that there's nowhere in the world that thistles are used as food, even just animal food, that would look like they would be arguing based on that point with Rabbi Eliezer, but that's not the case. And so, says this Gemara, and if so, they need only to check the reality to remove all grounds of dispute. In other words, if that's a point of contention about whether there's an area that feeds thistles to camels in the middle of nowhere, then, you can just go verify it. You can just go look. So the Gemara says that that's not really the reason. The sages assert that in a region where thistles are maintained for camels, they are prohibited in a vineyard, but in a region where they're not maintained, they are permitted. So the sages are saying, look, if you had a vineyard in Saudi Arabia somewhere, and you had thistles, and thistles are used to feed camels, then that's going to be edible, even though not by a human, but by an animal that's there. And if that's going to be the custom of the area there, you can't put that near a vineyard. That's going to be the idea. But over here in Eretz Yisrael, where they don't really have camels, and they're not really growing thistles, they're trying to use it for productive purposes, for the vineyards and the fields, well, that it's not going to be edible. And therefore, if thistles happen to be growing there, it would not render the vineyard to be Kilayim. So the Gemara turns back to Rabbi Lazar and says, what is the reason of Rabbi Lazar? And Gemara says that he holds that since thistles are maintained in at least one place, we have to prohibit that species in vineyards everywhere. So basically what they're saying is, look, because there's one area in the food, like some areas in Arabia, where thistles are going to be maintained to feed to camels, then you would have to forbid it everywhere. And the sages are basically saying, no, if you were going to only do it in that region, you would have to only forbid it in that region, but not everywhere. That's going to be the argument. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, and so does it not emerge that Rabbi Bar Zavda rules in accordance with Rabbi Lazar? And that would be interesting because it looks like it's contrary to the sages. And the Gemara is getting back to this point about Darnel, because, Darnel is maintained in some regions as food for doves. So perhaps if Darnel were growing next to this vineyard and it would be considered to be animal food, that might be a problem. If Darnel is in a region where it's not going to be used as animal food for doves, then it's not going to be like planting a variety of wheat next to a vineyard. The Torah specifically prohibits planting a variety of seed like wheat next to a vineyard. So that's going to be what the issue is. So the Gemara is going to look at Rabbi Bar Zavda's answer, and it says there, in a case of thistles, it is not the way of people to bring thistles from place to place. That means that, says the Rosh Hashanah, they're not taken to be sown in other places, and the sages therefore don't consider them to be significant. Basically what they're saying is that the sages are also ruling that thistles are prohibited only in a place where they're used for animal food and not somewhere else. The Gemara says, however, here, in the Mishnah's case of Darnel, it's the way of people to bring Darnel from place to place. And therefore, even the sages might agree that Darnel is forbidden everywhere. The Mishnah now, as explained by Rabbi Bar Zavda, would conform not only with Rabbi Eliezer, but also with the sages as well. So he makes everything fit together if that's going to be the case. Now, the Gemara established that Darnel is subject to the laws of Kalayam because it's fed to doves. The question arises and says, but then it should be Kalayam with wheat. And basically, Mishnah's, the question is that if in some places it's not edible at all, or in some places it's not edible by humans, only by animals, then wouldn't it be where you have a mixture of darnel and wheat, wouldn't that be Kalayim with one another? And Rosh really is pointing out that the Gemara is initially assuming that the Mishnah permitted Darnel with wheat because Darnel is not subject to the laws of Kalayim at all, since the Kalayim prohibition is limited to a species that's sown or at least maintained, and it would not apply to Darnel. But the question is going to be, well, maybe things are not like what it looks like. So since it's being shown to be fed to doves, and at least in some areas, it might be subject to the laws of Kalayim. So the Gemara is wondering why the Mishnah rules where Darnel and wheat are not going to be Kalayim with one another. The Gemara answers, and again, we're going to be getting into this agadic answer that's very deep. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yonah says, Darnel is a variety of wheat in as much as it grew from seeds of wheat. But the produce went astray, and instead of producing wheat, the seeds produced Darnel. And so basically, where it's saying to go astray, it's using the word zonah. And basically, this idea gets back to Bereshit Rabbah and 28:8. And it's saying this idea that, before the flood, when people had become corrupted with their ways in terms of robbery and sexual perversion, the land also behaved corruptly, and wheat would be planted, and the land would produce Darnel instead. And Darnel existing today has the origin in the Darnel that first grew then. In other words, all of these things that became deformed from the ground or that emerged, and things that we see today that are going to be these like corrupted versions of things, emerged back then. That's going to be the Rambam commentary. So that wheat sown today can become deformed in the ground and emerge as Darnel. That's the Rambam's point. And the Gemara says that the idea is that produce can go astray, which is zonah, it says, and that accords with the following brisa, which teaches that the Torah states over in Vayikra 19:29, says so that the land will not go astray by producing fruits different from the ones that were planted. In other words, they're like mutating into different things, different forms, corrupted forms, less useful forms. And the Gemara says we see from there that produce can go astray. In other words, one type of fruit will be planted and something will come out that is messed up and not useful. And the entire verse in Vayikra 19:29 says, do not profane your daughter to make her go astray, lest the land goes astray. Here too, we see the point that by straying from Hashem's will, the people cause the land to stray from its divinely ordained task. So, as an example, you would see that you're trying to plant wheat, and instead you have Darnel. And this all comes from personal virtue. In other words, getting back to Torah and mitzvot and intense learning about the laws of how the Torah works in a structured learning environment so that you can do the Torah laws accurately. And if you're not learning the Torah laws accurately, the halachot, then you are making mistakes, and you might even be religious, but making a lot of errors. And you will be punished for those errors because things are very exact. You have to do things a certain way. It's like we're living in a very finely tuned computer program, and in order to get the results that you want, you have to make all the steps accurately and correctly. And so if you are even failing on the last couple of steps, you end up with things that don't work out right, like a sin. And you get punished for those sins, even accidental things. Also incur liability. That's why there's a specific offering for uncertain sins. And so basically what we see here is a thing for Torah and Midot, a thing that we should look at who we are as people, and we should try to do the will of God. And the Torah is a toolbox to help you come back to this divinely ordained task, which is to fix the creation and to get humanity and the Jewish people back to the way it was from before the sin. That's what this whole life project is about. That's why you are here. You are here to refine yourself with Torah and mitzvot, because that is the only way that you can affect the upper worlds and also in this world and refine things back to getting back to the creation before the sin. And when you go away, things become corrupted, things descend, things decay. And so the form, the soul, and the material, when you have sin, will get further from the divine source and will become corrupted. And so the Torah uses the word zonah, that people understand as a woman who has corrupted her ways and is behaving corruptly and doing things that she shouldn't be doing. And it's not living up to the point of your potential. And, only by following the Torah are you following the will of God and why you were put here. You have a divinely ordained task and you are you should be living up to it. And the closer you get to Torah and mitzvot, you can start to live in this closeness and like in this shadow of like where you're just at the top of the creation and you're just below the all the higher worlds above you, and you're sort of like at the pinnacle where you have like material and these prime forms of material, and then you're there, and human consciousness and human soul and spirituality all following a certain derech, which is going to be the way of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as explained by Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher, and in accordance with the sages in the oral law. This is going to be the way that this is done, and you can return things back to how things were before the sin, so that things will become more refined, your soul will be more refined, your form, your material will be more refined. But when you sin and you go astray, you are degrading and falling, and you are making yourself further away, and you'll have less divine providence shining on you. And the divine providence that you do experience, you will experience as sin and punishment. So the Gemara wonders why the Mishnah rules it's going to be limited to one side of this Tanaic debate. So, in other words, we have the Tana Kama and Rabbi Eliezer. So, what's going on here? And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi asked before Rabbi Yirmiyah, and says, does our Mishnah accord only with Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi? Because a Baraisa teaches, says that Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, said in the name of his father that one may remove truma from wine for vinegar, because wine is superior to vinegar. Gemara says, but one may not remove truma from vinegar for wine, because vinegar is inferior to wine. Gemara says, however, if one transgressed the law and removed truma from wine for vinegar, his truma is valid. But Rebbe says wine and vinegar are two distinct species, and therefore one may not remove truma or meiser from one for the other. In other words, let's talk about this relationship between vinegar and wine, and this is going to be put in here because this is like the relationship between darnel and wheat. And since in both cases you have this higher form, and then you have a corrupted form. And so in the case of the corrupted form, you're going to have wine that turns into vinegar. The vinegar is going to be the corrupted form of the wine, and the darnel is going to be the corrupted form of the vinegar. And basically they're trying to say that, look, this case here in the Mishnah, which is saying that darnel and wheat are a single species, that would be like Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, who holds that wine and vinegar are the same species. But Rebbe does not hold that way. Rebbe holds that you can't separate one for the other. And so in the case of wheat and darnel, Rebbe would rule, contrary to our Mishnah, that they are in fact different species, and the combination of that would be forbidden as Kilayim. That is going to be how Rebbe would rule about this Mishnah. So the Gemara, and again, let me just reiterate that again, right? this Mishnah is going by the opinion of Rabbi Yossi's son. Okay? And basically, like Rabbi Yossi's son is saying that you can have a corrupted form like the vinegar of the wine, and that's going to be where you could separate one for another. You shouldn't do it, but if you did it retroactively, it's going to be like the same thing. It's going to be like a corrupted form of the same thing, and so it would dispatch the obligation. Rebbe says no. It's like two different things. You can't take this from that. Not for Truma, and not for your Meiser. And also, by the way, they're basically saying that over here, in the case of wheat and Darnel, Rebbe would also say it's like two different species. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi stared at Rabbi Yirmiyah waiting for an answer. And basically, the question is, well, how can you bring in the laws of Maisros for the laws of Kilayim here? That's the question. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says in his Gemara, he says to him, why are you staring at me? And he says, bring a strap for yourself. In other words, you deserve to be lashed for bothering me with such a foolish question. And the Gemara is saying that the two cases are going to be different. And the Brisa there is dealing with the laws of Maisros. And over here, the Mishnah is dealing with the laws of Kilayim. In other words, there's a distinction between the laws of Maisros and the laws of Kilayim. And the Brisa quoted here is one about tithing wine and vinegar. This, by the way, is also in Trumos chapter 2. And the Gemara is explaining that there's no dispute regarding biblical law. Everyone agrees that biblically, wine and vinegar belong to the same species. The question is, can one tithe wine for vinegar even initially? And, can you tithe vinegar on behalf of wine? Because, one's going to be an inferior corrupted version, the other's going to be superior. And the question is, would they be valid after the fact? And, would it be the Evid? Was it done or not? And Rebbe over there is saying that wine and vinegar are distinct species. Basically, he's saying that under rabbinic law, it's treated like they're two different things. And basically what they're saying is that the rabbis are prohibiting tithing wine for vinegar. But yes, even though it's biblically permitted, you shouldn't do it because one will not come to tithe vinegar on behalf of wine, and that is going to be offense because it's going to protect you from doing something biblically forbidden. So if you had vinegar, you have to tithe it, and so what they're saying is that one might not tithe the vinegar in the case where he has only other wine over there. And, he might not tithe this for that. He might not tithe the inferior thing for the superior thing. So they basically made a fence to protect you from breaking something that's going to be a biblical obligation. So we're going to see here that you can't mix the laws of Kilayim, no pun intended, with the laws over here with Maisros, because over here, this is going to be a rabbinic law. And that's, we're trying to figure out over here that, well, maybe these laws in Kilayim are really not, maybe these are not really rabbinic restrictions. And maybe these are really Deraita restrictions. In other words, being able to have wheat and Darnel together might actually be a Deraita thing. And over there, we're seeing that, the only reason that they're saying wine and vinegar are like two different species is because Rebbe and the rabbis are talking about a rabbinic fence that was put up because people will come not to tithe vinegar on behalf of wine, and they're even though they're permitted to tithe wine for vinegar, the reverse case where they're taking something corrupted and trying to tithe it for something that's superior, people won't do. So they said, okay, it's like two different species, don't do it at all. So over here we're seeing that the laws of Kilayim really don't resemble the laws of Maisros. That's really what it's trying to show. So even here, Rebbe, who subscribes to this rabbinic enactment, might accept this Mishnah's ruling with regard to Kilayim, that wheat and Darnel are actually going to be one species. And so this would be contrary to Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi's suggestion that Rebbe might not go with this Mishnah. And that's one way of reading it, as explained by the Pnei Moshe. So, this approach is basically saying, where it's saying like, why are you staring at me? Evidently, you're bringing up this unrelated example, and in fact, you're implying that Rebbe might not accept this, and in fact, there is a distinction between maestros and Kilayim, and you're creating this problematic thing where you're making it look like Rebbe might not even accept this Mishnah. The Chazan Ish is going to explain it like this in his laws on Kalayam, in his book on Kalayam 3.9, and he's going to explain this Gemara as follows. He's going to say, a species is not defined the same way in regard to Kalayam as it is regard to tithes, and the law of Kalayam forbids having two species grow together. Therefore, the definition of a species is based on a physical nature of the growing plant, and accordingly, Darnel is a form of wheat, and they're classified as one species with respect to Kalayim. But the mitzvah of maestros, by contrast, says the Chazan Ish, relates not to a product as it is growing, but to separating a portion of a processed product and then giving it to a Goan or a Levi. And a species is therefore defined by the type of benefit the Goan or the Levi can derive from it. And based on this determination, Rebbe would regard wine and vinegar as a different species with regards to maestros. Why? Because they have different uses. And that is the explanation about this by the Chazan Ish. Now, the Gemara is going to just come up and finish, and then we'll get into part 2 of the shiur tomorrow, talking about barley and oats. But right now, Rabbi Yonah says that indeed Rabbi Yirmiyah should have stared at Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi for not knowing this distinction. And the Gemara says, for whenever the earlier rabbis sought to determine this matter, in other words, a relationship between our Mishnah and a Baraisa, they would determine it as follows. They would say the Baraisas, where it's going to deal with the laws of maestros, whereas the Mishnah here deals with the laws of Kilayim. And the distinction is thus where you had like in previous generations, and that's going to be something that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi should have been aware of, and the Gemara puts it in here to make us aware of it. In other words, when they're trying to look at similarities between maestros or Kilayim, the sages back then would say the Baraisa there deals with the laws of maestros because these are all in one category, and they're not like the laws of Kilayim. And the Mishnah over here is dealing with the laws of Kilayim, which is another set of laws with its own logic and category, and you can't mix them. And as we see in this last case, we have a rabbinic restriction, and it's going to be where it's going to be there to try to protect people who are not learned enough from making a biblically forbidden thing. That would be coming to tithe vinegar on behalf of wine, and people might not go do it and make a deraita mistake, because they would say, I can't take this inferior thing and tithe it on behalf of a superior thing, b'diavad. And so to make sure that people don't get into that mistake, they said, like what Rebbe's saying, it's like two different species. But where you're talking about two different species, you can't take that over here to the laws of Kalayam. That's what this is trying to teach. Have a great day.